Okay, so picture this. It's 1943. The whole world is at war. Out in the Atlantic, German U-boats are wrecking Allied ships, and the U.S. Navy is desperate for any kind of advantage to protect its fleet. So today, let's dive into a story that asks a pretty wild question. Just how far were they willing to go?
I mean, really think about that. Did the United States military, in the middle of World War II, actually figure out how to teleport a massive warship? It's the core question of one of the wildest, most persistent military legends of all time.
Now, the story goes, this wasn't just some fancy new camouflage. This was a full-on attempt to make a ship literally invisible, using theories cooked up by geniuses like Einstein and Tesla. So on that day, October 28th, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, they supposedly flipped a switch on the USS Eldridge, and poof, the ship was just gone.
So how in the world does a 1,200-ton destroyer just vanish into thin air? The story that's been passed around for decades is honestly stranger and more fantastic than any sci-fi movie you can think of. All right, so here's how the impossible journey supposedly went down. First, witnesses said this weird glowing green fog started swirling around the ship. Then, a massive flash of blue light and the Eldridge wasn't in the harbor anymore. But it didn't just turn invisible. Oh no, it apparently reappeared almost instantly over 200 miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, completely freaking out the sailors there, before it vanished again and zapped right back to its dock in Philly. The whole trip took just a few minutes. Insane, right? So the experiment worked, if you want to call it that. But teleporting a ship and its crew came at a horrifying price. When that ship reappeared for the final time, the scene on board was something from a straight-up nightmare. This right here, this is probably the most terrifying detail of the whole legend. The idea is that these crazy electromagnetic fields tore apart the atoms of the crew and the ship, then put them back together. But the process wasn't perfect. Men were found with their arms, their legs, their entire bodies literally embedded in the solid steel of the ship, a grotesque fusion of man and machine. And the guys who survived, well, they weren't much better off. Some went stark raving mad, talking about seeing other dimensions. Others would apparently just phase out of existence. They'd literally fade away into thin air, never to be seen again. So yeah, you can see why, if even a fraction of this was true, the Navy would want to bury this story deep. For more than a decade, this absolutely horrific story was kept under wraps, completely secret. That is, until a series of very, very strange letters brought the whole thing out into the open. So there's this astronomer and UFO researcher, Morris K. Jessup. He'd written a book, and one day he gets this bizarre letter written in a jumble of different colored inks from a guy named Carlos Allende. Allende claims he was on a nearby ship and that he saw everything, the green fog, the disappearance, all of it. And he described what happened to the crew in gruesome detail. And this is where the story gets even weirder. The actual Office of Naval Research, the ONR, contacts Jessup. Why? Because they'd received a copy of his book in the mail, filled with handwritten notes from someone who seemed to know way too much about this experiment. Then, a few years later, Jessup is found dead in his car. The official story was suicide, but to the believers, well, they were convinced he was silenced for getting too close to the truth. So, you have this incredible, terrifying story. Secret science, a government cover-up, a teleporting warship, men fused into steel, a dead researcher. It's the stuff of legends. But here's the big question. Is any of it actually true? Okay, let's hit the brakes on the conspiracy train for a second. Let's strip away the green fog, the teleportation, all of it. The truth of the story actually starts with a real and, frankly, very clever piece of World War II naval tech. And this is it. This is the kernel of truth that the entire legend grew out of. It's called degaussing. See, the Navy was making ships invisible, just not to our eyes. They'd wrap these massive electrical cables around a ship to cancel out its magnetic field. This made it totally undetectable to the Germans' nasty magnetic mines and torpedoes, which were a huge, huge threat. And right there, that is the huge misunderstanding. The myth takes the word invisible and runs with it into science fiction. The reality was a practical, life-saving military tactic. You can just imagine a sailor being asked what he's doing and joking, "Oh, we're making the ship invisible." And from a comment like that, a legend is born. So what about our star eyewitness, Carlos Allende? Well, it turns out his real name was Carl Allen, and he was a bit of an eccentric with a history of spinning some pretty wild yarns. In fact, he even admitted at one point that he made the whole story up. Now, he did later take that confession back, which only added fuel to the fire for people who wanted to believe. So when you line up the legend against the actual provable facts, the whole story just kind of falls apart. The key witness was a known prankster. The super-secret experiment was actually a common, well-known procedure. And here's the final nail in the coffin. The USS Eldridge's own official ship logs show it wasn't even in Philadelphia on that day. It was hundreds of miles south on a cruise in the Bahamas.
So if the evidence is so stacked against it, why are we still talking about the Philadelphia experiment? Why does this story have such incredible staying power? Well, it's because it's got all the perfect ingredients for a myth that just refuses to die. You start with a little piece of real science, degaussing. You add a really creative storyteller in Carl Allen. You mix it all up in the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, when everyone was already suspicious of the government. And then you tap into a very powerful, very real fear. And that's really what keeps this legend alive. It's not actually about one specific ship anymore. It's about that deep, unsettling idea that governments are out there racing to create technology so advanced and so powerful that they might not even be able to control it, with horrific consequences for the ordinary people caught in the middle. So that leaves us with one last, pretty fascinating question. The Philadelphia experiment is a story about a real thing, a real procedure that got twisted by imagination and fear into this incredible legend. And it just makes you wonder, how many other conspiracies or modern myths that we've all heard are just like this one? A simple, misunderstood truth just waiting to be uncovered.